is Mr. Satya Yasha. So recently we worked together on a few articles on digital health passports that were published in the Convergence magazine for MCMC and by MCMC, and also The Edge. So thank you, Satya, for asking me to chair this session, even though I know as much as the next person on data sovereignty. Hopefully I'll be doing a good job. Let me introduce the speakers. Okay, and we are very lucky to have them with us today because they're all very high ranked people in their respective companies, and I'm sure they're very busy. Okay, so the first panelist I would like to introduce is Mr. Beni Azwa Muhammad, who is the Chief Security and Risk Consulting for Nexagate since 2012. So since that, he has led various information security risk and compliance consulting projects across various verticals in both public and private sector. His main area of expertise is in information security management systems, helping clients implementing information security practices and certification to the ISO IEC 2701 standard every year. So he is an expert in the field of service management systems. So other areas of expertise includes DLP consulting, BCMS consulting, and certification and cybersecurity framework consulting. And one of his strengths is his very strong empathy towards his clients, and he always ensures that the client is left happy and satisfied with the services that Nexagate delivers. So this is a key factor that makes companies keep returning to his consulting services and expert advice. Okay, so the next person I want to introduce is Mr. Muzakir. Now, Mr. Muzakir is the Chief Operating Officer from Aerodyne Group Malaysia. So Aerodyne Group Malaysia is the world's second-ranked drone service provider, leading almost 500 aero ranges, delivering world-class solutions to global clients. So Muzakir is an engineer by background with a master's degree in engineering from the UK. He is equipped with more than 4 years of project management experience in oil and gas, construction, power lines, agriculture, and monitoring projects with major clients, combined with 5 years experience in drone-related development, research, and applications of all types of drones. Okay, so he has been working in various roles and drives the digital transformation for multiple government agencies and companies in Malaysia. Okay, and the final panelist today is Mr. Shahrir Nizam Jalis, who's also the Chief Commercial Officer of our host. Okay, he is an experienced technologist with a demonstrated history of working in the telecommunications industry, skilled in SDN, NFV, SD1, big data analytics, security, very enthusiastic with new emerging digital businesses. He is a digital transformation expert with a track record of over 20 years. Okay, now, before we go much further, let's get to the very basic of things, because I'm sure in our audience there's people who do not know that much about data sovereignty and want a bit of clarification on the subject. So what we'll do is we'll go to the very basis of data sovereignty. What is it? And I will let Mr. Shahrir answer that for us.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Shima, for the introduction. I think it's really a great honor to be here today with all the great individuals coming from different industry background. Thank you very much to Mr. Beni from Nexagate and also Mr. Muzakir from Aerodyne Group Malaysia. And definitely for our lovely moderator, Dr. Shima, thank you very much for the participation in our webinars today. So allow me to go a bit technical about the subject that we are going to discuss today. Data are individual facts, statistics, or items of information that are collected through observation. So in a more technical sense, data are set of values of qualitative or quantitative variables. So this is something like, you just get the data coming from all sorts of the information. So talking about person, talking about the object is all the data that we can actually collect it and put it somewhere. So talking about sovereignty, this is a supreme authority within a territory. It means that sovereignty can be assigned to the person, body, or institution that has the ultimate authority over other people. So when you combine it together, in the more technical sense, data sovereignty refers to the concept that the data an organization collects, stores, and process it is subject to the nation's laws and general best practices where it is physically located. So if I try to make it a layman term a bit, so you talk about the business that has stored some of our personal information of its customer in a way that is actually complies with all the data privacy regulation, the best practices and the guidelines of the host country. So one might ask, what is the difference between data sovereignty and data residency? Because it's like two parts of a coin, right? So although they are having a similar meanings, it is very easy for us to actually confuse the term, because I think by the end of the day, people will ask, do we have to actually comply with the data sovereignty so that we have the compliance on data residency? So let me break up the understanding a bit more. When we talk about the data residency, it's when the business of government specifies the geographical location of the data. So it is really related to the location of the data that is being as the result of the policy or regulation related reason. So if I just want to give some example, right? So a nation might have some favorable data privacy laws that actually helps the enterprises in handling data related processes. So sometimes because of the favorable regulatory environment, business would choose this country to store their data. So this is what we talk, what we trying to understand about data residency. So the company will use that location to store their information, and it will kept in that particular country with that infrastructure to host, all this data. So the excellent example of the regulation related data residency, when you talk about, the favorable tax environment. So sometimes the country might have some, some benefit when talk about the tax. So the business will make sure that the data will actually operate and stored inside that particular country's nation borders. So it's all related to the geographical location of the data. So when talk about the data sovereignty, it is actually on top of it. So when we talk about the sovereignty, it's a geographical data together with the subject of the nation's law. So the data, the data sovereignty will make sure the data that the information that subject to legal punishment and protection of the country will actually be imposed when it is where it is physically stored. So all in all, if you look into the relationship of two, it's just like the two sides of the same coin. So the one is a matter of just a national legal rights and obligation. The other one is just a matter of geography. So I think one interesting fact that I just want to share here, when we talk about the data, right? So it's a very mind-boggling volume of data is going to be created. So we talked about by 2024, a total estimation of about 149,000 zettabytes of data will be created. So the question is, where we want to store this data? So talking about data sovereignty or data residency. So I think we talk about when talking about the breach of the data, I believe that my fellow panelists would have a better view about the security of this data. So I just want to give some example of the current use of day to day that we as a fellow citizen of Malaysia been using. I like to take the example of My Sejahtera. So some of our personal data, five years back, is very confidential. We talk about the information about our whereabouts, the vaccination information is actually confidential inside the private location. So now, because of the MySejahtera the being imposed to us, some of this data may or may not be sovereign in Indonesia. So we need to really ask ourselves what is in it for us, because by the end of the day, we do have the PDPA. We do have a lot of law that being imposed to actually protect our personal data. But are we sure? Are we really sure about there's no way for any hackers in the world can actually stealing any of our data? So I think that might give some background, some foundation of us to really understanding why we need to have the data sovereignty. So I think that will actually answer the first question from Dr. Shima. Pass back to you again. Back to you, Dr. Shima.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sharir, for that very detailed explanation. When you talk about geographical location being part of data sovereignty, am I right to assume that all the data in Malaysia, the confidential data of all its citizens, are stored within the boundaries of Malaysia? Perhaps you would like to answer that, or should we let Mr. Benny answer that because he's going to be talking to us about clouds?
I think it would be good for Mr. Benny to actually answer it in the Malaysian.
He would like to know all our confidential data. And bear in mind here, everybody, I am no subject expert matter in the field of data sovereignty. Where are our data stored now? I mean, we know that Google knows where we've been to every single moment through our phones. Where is all this information stored? Mr. Benny, you want to answer?
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Shima, for the question, and also thank you, Tia Shari Nizam. You already painted a very comprehensive landscape on the data sovereignty is all about. So I think before I move to answer to this question, let me clarify a bit or briefly explain on the a few differences between the cloud deployment models, the one that we known as public cloud, private cloud, and also the hybrid cloud that normally offers by the main giants, the CSP, cloud service provider like the AWS, Amazon, Google, GCP, Azure by the Microsoft, and also ABC by the Alibaba. So looking into this, a bit of difference between these three setup model or cloud deployment models. Public cloud is refers to something that we share our resources, we share our computing services among our different customers, even though their customer data and application that could running hidden from other cloud customers. So, but these cloud resources, it being owned and operated by the third-party cloud service provider that I mentioned earlier. That is public cloud. Looking into the private cloud, the terminology of public and private. Private, on the other hand, is that the services is not shared with any other organizations. It is solely to you, and then it being the infrastructure being created solely for a single organization. It can be managed by the organization itself or any other third party, whether it is on-prem or off-prem. So the terminology of public cloud and private cloud, if we go in a layman term, when you renting an apartment or when you living in an apartment and also you living in your landed house. In an apartment, if you have a swimming pool that you are using, a shared swimming pool with others, if you on a private cloud where you have your own private pool inside your boundary within your house. So that is the main distinction between these two. the private and also public, because I would like to relate it back towards how this public and private cloud could relate toward the data sovereignty. But the relation is not that straightforward, as per mentioned by Nizam, where the data sovereignty is when you have a data that being put in within the borders and then you impose a law and regulation towards it. So, but then another terminology being used within the deployment model, whereby we said about the hybrid cloud. This is a model that is a combination of both public and also private. So I think from this understanding, by having a private in nature, the private cloud, of course, offering a more control, reflecting towards the higher level of the privacy of your own data, the data on the MySejahtera and so on. All right. So, and then because of this, private cloud are often used by the government agencies, used by the FI, financial institution, and also it being used by the some of the mid to large size organization, known as a large enterprise, with a really critical business data or operations that what they want is to enhance a control over their environment. When you have a control over your environment, then you have a control over your data. So based on this understanding of the differences of the cloud deployment models on the public, private, and also hybrid cloud, how does it help? How does it relate towards a data sovereignty? As I mentioned, it is not a direct relation, but what we could portray within this webinar to relate back toward the data sovereignty, as explained by the Nizam, that the data sovereignty itself is about the data that is subject to the law and governance structure within the nation. So whereby it is collected and it is closely linked to we call it data security. So generally this effort, it refers to the government efforts to prevent their citizen data. That is about the PII, personally identifiable information, whereby that is our data within the MySejahtera, from falling towards the wrong hands and via the measure, and how to restrict the business from do the transferring of those personal information beyond the country borders, beyond Malaysian borders. All right. So if I take one of the prominent example, it is not within Malaysia, it's not within ASEAN. It is in the Europe. People know it as a GDPR. GDPR is a General Data Protection Regulation. It is a law that enforced by the EU bloc and EU bloc on the data protection and privacy. So looking in specific to this law on the sovereignty, this law, it implements a very strict rule on how the organization handle the personal information of the EU citizens. That is the PII. Even when the company processes the data outside of the EU region. That's how they maintain their sovereignty of their EU citizen that living outside of the EU bloc. So in the Europe, one of the example in the Europe, when the organization can be fined up to the 4% of the annual global turnover. This is what we call about the law and regulation being imposed to the organization that processing the data. If any of these organization break the GDPR data sovereignty regulation in EU itself. So 4% of annual global turnover is quite huge amount of money. And so with this example, I think I believe in order to adhere to the data sovereignty regulations, the company, the organizations will need to look into the solution that could help them to avoid this kind of incident. The incident that I meant is the data breach. So that's the only way that we could relate with the private cloud and also protection of the data sovereignty in the perspective of data breach. So since the private cloud offer a better data security protection, we can relate that the likelihood of the data leakage, data breach in the private cloud environment could be further reduced. So hence, this deployment model can be one of the better choice as compared to public cloud. So however, there's a drawback on the private cloud environment, whereby you have a dedicated resource, you need to invest a lot of cost, whether you are actually using those resources effectively or not. So then it goes towards the how the hybrid cloud could play a role within this context. So looking into the hybrid cloud approach, where it can solve some of the challenges posed by the data sovereignty, whereby with the organization that own a private cloud environment, they overcome these challenges without losing the benefit of the public cloud. But then hybrid cloud allows the company to choose what data they want to deploy to the public and what data they want to keep on the private cloud. So in the sense of by knowing your data, what data, the criticality of the data, the classification of data, then you can segregate the data that meant for the public, you can put within the public environment. The data that meant toward the critical data that could affect by the data sovereignty, that data that you should put at your back end in the private cloud. Hence, instead of investing a lot of cost for the whole environment of the private cloud, then you can have a mixture of a hybrid cloud with respect towards your criticality of data. Then you can further have a cost benefit and also have a good deployment towards upholding the data sovereignty. So it is based on the organization how to deploy between the public, private, and also hybrid. All these cloud deployment model play their role in upholding the data sovereignty within the nation that is being governed. All right, okay, back to you, Doctor.
Okay, before I say anything, Tia Shari, would you like to add to that? Because you seem to want to add to what Mr. Benny was saying.
I think I like the idea that being posed by Mr. Benny on the the implementation of the hybrid cloud. So just instead of just looking from the private or just a private or public or just a public, so now we talk about the hybrid cloud, the model that actually can and will actually uphold the idea of data sovereignty. So talking about ACASIA itself, right? So we do have the private network within ASEAN. So it's just a matter of adding up some of the compute and storage on top of this network to actually giving out the services of the private cloud. So we can actually work together with people in the market to actually come up with the hybrid model together. So in the sense that when we talk to the market side, right? So the hybrid cloud is always being the best option currently for the people in industry to actually pushing their data storage utilization. So I pretty much likes the idea coming from Mr. Benny. And we hope that we as in ACASIA will always be the strongest proponent for the data sovereignty for ASEAN. Right. So pass back to Dr. Shima. Right.
Thank you, Tia Shahrir. So there you have it, folks. ACASIA has the infra ready for a hybrid cloud for data sovereignty. Take advantage of it. Okay, and then what we really want to know now is, okay, the European bloc has the PDPR in place. Does ASEA has one in place? Shahrir, would you know?
I don't think we have it as a one ASEAN yet. But definitely by each country, they have their own act on the personal data. So take the example of Malaysia, PDPA has been there since 2011. Then there's a lot of other initiative that actually can come together with it because PDPA is just just an act. So we need to have the national policy talking about the infrastructure to actually supporting this policy, and also what we need to do now after this introduction is actually the enforcement of it. So the enforcement of it, I think this is where we still lacking in Malaysia. But talking about the ASEAN itself, there are some countries that actually really pushing for it, like in the likes of Singapore. They do have a very strong policy in terms of data, because I think become the hub in ASEAN, one of the big hub in ASEAN. They localize some of the data on the ASEAN in Singapore border. So they do have a very strong act to actually govern, the data and make it sovereign in Singapore. Right.
Okay, good. So we know what's going on in Singapore. They're pushing for it. But how about Malaysia? Let's look at what's happening in Malaysia in terms of the regulators. Let's have Mr. Muzakir answer that question for us. How are we enforcing the laws for data sovereignty in Malaysia? Over to you, Mr. Muzakir.
All right. Assalamualaikum. Good afternoon, and thank you, Dr. Shima. I think great. Mr. Shahrir has briefed the concept and also what we have, right? And also Mr. Benny tadi bagi you've given quite detailed examples of the options that we have as well, right? So the angle that I'll be coming in from today would be slightly different. Whereas where we are as coming as service providers, right? So we provide services in a lot of fields in different backgrounds, but we are dealing with a lot of data, right? So I think Dr. Shima's question just now in terms of regulation and also what we have in Malaysia is a really important question, right? So even by day we still look into the kind of regulation that we have and really the kind of monitoring that the government is having as well, right? I would agree we have the PDPA, but that has been established for quite some time. That's number one, right? Number two, whether it's comprehensive enough to cover a lot of all the advancement in terms of the technology that we have today, right? So let's take one of our key components in Aerodyne is really providing drone services, all right? That covers a lot of different kind of data, not only sensors, readings, images as well, right? Just to give you perspective. For us in Aerodyne, in Malaysia itself, every day we are dealing with hundreds gigabytes of data coming in, and then we need to comprehend, analyze, process, and also deliver to the clients all those data. So you can imagine for one company, that's the scale and size that we have, right? And imagine we have hundreds of companies doing the same thing. So that's the scale of data we are dealing with in Malaysia. And if not being monitored or really regulated properly, that is the leakages that can happen, compromising not only the clients that we have but the country as a whole, right? So based on our engagement, I think we've had recently this year we've had few engagement with the authorities in terms of the kind of data protection that we would have for our services, right? So certain agencies, certain bodies, government bodies, they did highlight they have few acts or regulations in place in terms of data protection, the kind of data that needs to be protected and governed by which kind of law, right? So they did mention about that, but I think that covers the first point that I would want to highlight is about awareness, whether the people in Malaysia would really know about all those regulations, right? So we deal with data every day. Sometimes it looks quite straightforward, sharing of images through WhatsApp, for example, right? So that looks simple enough. You just hold and forward and everything would be distributed accordingly, right? But if you look at another angle which were highlighted during our session, those kind of data is really protected by law. That's number one. And also it should be monitored and governed by them as well, right? but how do we know what data all the people would have, right? So it's go as simple as, they are they are different fields or backgrounds that they cover. For sure, in normal condition, we would understand the data for the armies, police, all those would be governed properly. And people would expect that to be governed properly as well, right? So even people want to share, they would think at least twice, right, before do the sharing. But as simple as oil and gas industry in Malaysia, for example, that's one of the biggest industry in Malaysia. So all the images, the data, all the measurement sensors, all those kind of data should be protected to a certain extent as well. Again, next would be power lines, right? That's one of our key clients. So power lines, you can imagine you have TNB power line just outside your house, right? So you would have TNB poles. All those kind of data is protected as well, right? But to what extent do we have the visibility? What are the levels of protection needed, right? So in the acts, they did mention all these kind of industries are protected by law, but what kind of protection and also to what extent is another question that needs to be answered as well, right? So that those are the kind of information, right, that we had during our session, right? So even in one, if I'm mistaken, in one of the sections in those act would be prohibition to take photos for those asset, right? As simple as that, right? But for us, we are dealing with the data. We take those photos, right, for our clients. So we are fine. We know we need to protect those data. That's where, from our angle, it's important to have a secured infrastructure for our clients and also for the country as a whole, right? So the engagement, I believe Mr. Benny did mention just now, three different infrastructure model that we can have, private, public, and also hybrid kind of thing. All right, I think that's similar to what we offer to our clients as well. Big vendors like Microsoft, Google, AWS, Amazon, right? So they do have those kind of arrangement, right? But at the same time, with a certain client, they would prefer to have a localized, inside their infra kind of thing. So they have their own data center. They have their own security protocols, and also the integration with their system is important as well, right? So that's logical for big companies who can really invest in those kind of arrangement, right? But how about the smaller companies, smaller industries, where they can't really invest in having those secured facility? So that's where I think the options that Mr. Benny highlighted just now really make sense, because we need to define the kind of data we are dealing with, all right, and also categorize which data should be parked in public, for example, right? To make sure we have effective cost optimization as well, right? So I think one of the key step that we bring in our solution, just to make sure um, the security and also the governance of the data is at its best, is really we provide offering where privacy and security by design. So by default, any services that we provide, it should come with a security and also privacy protocol as well, right? So this is something that we bring not only for our Malaysian clients, but we are operating globally. So with all these different standards that we have in different countries, that's really valuable, because when we have operations in other countries, like Mr. Shahrir mentioned just now, and also Mr. Benny as well, in the Europe, they have their own standards, for example, right? So at the same time, in Australia, for example, we have different standards that we need to follow as well. So the comparisons between these standards globally, right, would be important, because we want to have the best arrangement possible for the clients. Not only to provide the best services, but to protect all those data for the country, right? So that's one of the key aspect that we provide I think important for all service providers, regardless in whichever field, would need to bear in mind and start providing that in the offerings as well, right? I think another aspect that we bring in the solution, as simple as customized user-defined access, right? So selected users, selected people would have selected type of access to the data. So this is important as well, right? So for our clients in Malaysia, this is key component because not all data can be shared across the organization, right? So it's not only about sharing to different party, but even internally within the organization, within the client's organization, there should be some kind of monitoring and also separation between the access as well, right? Because leaks not only happen when you have hackers or those who intentionally do it, right? But it can happen when you have the situation, accidental situation where it's being shared accidentally and it's not really intentionally done, right? So that's why that access segregation, all right, the structure of the access segregation is important. For most of our projects, we do have those discussion early on. All right, during the project execution part, we need to define, the kind of access those teams would have, because really knowing the structure of the client's organization would be important as well, right? So I think that's the angle that we have, providing services all throughout the years, right, to our clients. And we can see the big companies having multiple data centers globally, that really help the clients or us even, right, to really go into different market with different regulations. As Mr. Sharin mentioned, in Malaysia we have the PDPA, but it's quite generic to a certain extent, and also whether it's updated to the latest technology or not, that's another question, right? But when we go in different regions, right, in the Europe, in the US, even in Australia, as close as Australia as well, right? So they have their own standards, right? So having data reside in that country specifically doesn't really confirm sovereignty as a whole, right? But that's a step towards that direction to make sure that the protection is there to a certain extent. And also governance by location is another an important concept, because having those data residing in that country means we need to make sure we follow those countries' regulation as well, right? So that is key, and also challenging at the same time. Being a Malaysian company, we need to understand, right? But that's where I think from experience, from the team that we have as well, and also connection, collaboration with different companies would be important. It's not really about ourselves specifically, but it's really about the governance as a whole for the whole nation as well, right? So I think that's where I think personally my suggestion for better protection would be looking into the laws that we have globally, not only in Malaysia. Yes, it's not compulsory to follow other countries' law, but for sure, having those references would be helpful. So that's something that we can do immediately, not waiting for other parties to really do something about it. So each and every one of us can do something about it, and having those references from different part of the world as a standard, and also something that we can dictate as well, being making it as our company's reference and governance policy as well, right? So we don't need only the Malaysian government to do the policy. We can create our own policy internally in our own organization, in our own capacity as well. So that's the angle that I think we can be coming from, and that would be helpful for the whole data protection as a whole, right? I think that's the key aspect that we have, based on our experiences that we have so far. And the kind of regulation that we have over here in Malaysia, might not be really updated yet, but it can be a good reference for us to adapt with other nations' references as well. Right? I think that's all from me for now. Over to you, Dr. Shima.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Muzakir. I agree. I think it's a good idea to constantly benchmark ourselves, our regulations with other countries to see that we are on par, that we are taking the right steps in protecting the data of the country, especially confidential information. And I think that Mr. Muzakir, that you are lucky because you're working with a lot of different nations where you are exposed to the laws of the country, and you probably know a lot that is missing in Malaysia, and perhaps that this could be helpful for us as well in constructing new laws and regulations in terms of the PDPA, which brings me to the next question that I have, and I would like to allocate this question to Mr. Benny, and that is on the security issues. Okay, what is, with regards to security, how do we address data privacy and trust issues? Because he is the chief security officer of Nexagate. So let's see, how can you explain to us in terms that are layman terms of our responsibilities? I think Mr. Muzakir did a good job of saying that his organization, his company is being responsible, creating new policies internally. How about our own individual self? How do we enforce, how do we address data privacy and trust issues?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Shima. Okay, the question about the privacy and trust issue, if I understand it correctly, right? How to address it. So, okay, about the privacy and trust issue, it get back towards the what we call as confidential data, what people known as confidential data. But what is exactly confidential data? So this confidential data is the one that we known as what terminology being used within the law is the PII. PII is the personally identifiable information. So as simple as your name together with your phone numbers, even your name with your health status, even your name with your religion, even your name with your medical condition, even your political on what drive that you go for, that is within the bound of the PII. This data is belong to the person itself. In a large context, it belong towards the organizations. So when we talk about the privacy it more towards the singular person. So that is what we normally relate it to the PII. So when we talk about the PII, this is one of the standard that being used widely. I believe this is also the standard that being pursued by the Aerodyne. So how to give the assurance? So addressing privacy and trust issue, how to give the assurance that, for example, your data is safe with me, the other data is safe with Aerodyne. So giving an assurance, you need to have a proof. So by having a proof, you need to implement a specific best practices. So the most commonly used best practices and being accepted across the world, because when we work global, we need to have on the same page with other country or other nations. So the most accepted standards, it is called the ISO 27001. This is we known as ISMS in the acronym of Information Security Management System. So the basis of the Information Security Management System, how do you implement the security best practices at the minimum risk? You can't eliminate the risk up until zero. It is not logical at all. But how you can manage your risk so that the risk is at the minimum level. That is about the ISO 27001, which is widely accepted management system across the world. It being used by the I think the North America region, the EU European region, even in China, in the APEC, and in the even in the Middle East and also the African region. So within these best practices, if I go into a detail, it being accepted, there are 14 domains, the best practices, whereby within these 14 domains, there are 114 control of best practices that could be adopted by any of the company in order to address the data privacy and trust issue. So one of the widely known under the domain of the compliance. Under the domain of compliance, a specific control that need to be adhered is how we protect on the PII. So this need to be demonstrated. And then the demonstration of this specific control, it being audited internally and it being audited externally. Right? So this is one of the area that map directly. The other domain within the best practices in terms of security is about when Mr. Mood mentioning about the access control. So by having access control is one of the area that should be looked into. But we are working with a lot of clients, and the client is a global client, and then it being governed by a different nature of law into a data sovereignty. So by having a federated of access control, that is what people are going now in order to provide the assurance. The keyword is assurance in providing the privacy and also the trust issue. But when we look into the standard itself, 001 or the 27,000 family, there are another standard that in specific, which is on the 27,017 and 27,018, whereby on the 2717 look into in detail on the conformance toward the best practices on the cloud services. So this is what we talk about the private cloud, the public cloud, and also hybrid cloud. Then there's another standard which is 27017. It is about in specific about the PII that being used operating in the cloud services. So these two standard or standard guideline, it called as a code of practice within the 27,000 family. It being used to subset or it being used to we call it in the term of the auditing conformance. It being used as a conformance towards the 001 standard. The 001 standard, we have those 14 domains within the 017 and 018. In those specific domains and control, it being looked into how it being implemented within the cloud environment to give at the end of the day the assurance. The assurance will be translated into the data privacy and trust issue. So I'd like to give an example on our CSP, the renowned CSP, which is the AWS, Amazon Web Services, GCP, Google Cloud Platform, and also Alibaba Cloud, and also Microsoft Azure. These are four renowned cloud provider. So if you go and look into each of these cloud provider, this cloud provider also do implement the ISO 27001, do also confirm to the 27017, and also do also confirm to the ISO 27018. Why this giant need to go for this standard? Because if they do not go even for this standard, even across the world, people will still render the services. But what is the governance? Because this cloud provider is operating on different nation and it being bounded by different law and also different data sovereignty. So by having this standard being applied across the global, then they will give the assurance toward the nation, maybe Malaysia, Singapore, within the Asian country, within the European region, that they are following the best practices that being accepted across the world. So that is how the addressing on the data privacy and trust issue can be put in a global, because when we look into the standard is about implementing the policy, the standard is about implementing the technology, also the standard looking into how to build the competency and also the awareness as mentioned by Mr. Moon. So the three main key component, the policy is being covered, the infrastructure of the technology also being covered, even the people, the awareness and also the competency being covered in those angles. Holistically, the ecosystem of those three angles, what we normally call three pieces, process, people and product, being covered within the standard that being accepted worldwide in order to address the privacy and trust issue. So when we go to each of these cloud provider, they do provide the certificate that they are being certified with those standards, and where is the location of each of their infrastructure that being certified. That's on the global. When we look into, for example, Aerodyne, for example, ACASIA, and also, for example, Nesagate in specific, we also do implement the same thing. How do we give an assurance towards our client? We are not providing an infrastructure. We are providing a services. Those services, how people could have an assurance that we are also implementing 27001. We are also confirmed to 27017. We are also confirmed to 27018. In the sense as we are also on the same level as AWS, GCP, Azure, and also ABC in terms of adhering to the assurance of the security. At the end of the day, it's about the data privacy and trust issue. Then there's no boundary if we want to go outside of Malaysia, cross border, and then to apply and adopt to the rule and regulation of other nation. Then in specific to uphold the data sovereignty. Okay, Dr. Shima, get back to you.
Thank you. Okay, understand. We've got all these best practices in place, but let's just think about the worst case scenario. If the data is leaked, what are the consequences? What are the consequences? Say it's been hacked, our data is leaked, and, you know, put that out there in public, or a certain government gets hold of it. What would be the consequences of that? Mr. Benny or Mr. Shari want to answer? Or Mr. Muzakir? Up to you guys. Who wants to answer first?
Maybe I give my perspective on the consequences, Dr. Shima. The first thing is about the image and the integrity. So about the image and integrity, because every organization, they are operating on the costing. So the integrity and image, it translates towards the trust. The trust translates to the opportunities. The opportunity translates to the business. So that's the main thing. It will indirectly will contribute to the declining in terms of the business opportunity. So in other sense, people will look into the how the law and regulation being imposed, so that people will follow. That's the rule and regulation that come with the enforcement and also penalty. That is what being addressed within the specific act within the country that govern the data sovereignty. For example, Malaysia on the PDPA 2010, Singapore on the PDPA 2012, the EU bloc on the GDPR. So these are the two areas being looked in specific from my perspective. Maybe Tia Shari Nizam or Mr. Mo would like to add on it.
Okay, please do. Tia Shari, you want to add something on that?
I think I want to echo what Mr. Benny did mention about, the PDPA regulation and also enforcement. I think when we talk about, we as a nation, or perhaps as a regional, a regional player, ACASIA, right? Talking about ACASIA, we do have a really strong, presence in all of these countries, in ASEAN. But talking about the data itself, I think the awareness among, the enterprises and also the SMEs on how they want to actually protect their data, which is PII, probably PII. We don't have the visibility on the data that they want to store. Probably they don't have, the push factor, just for them to actually putting their data in a more secured and also private manner. So when we talk about, the breaching of these data, right? When the data is being leaked out to the market, to the people outside, definitely the image, yes, the branding, the information that can be used from that information that being shared might jeopardizing the personal life of the people that being the data being breached. I take an example of the credit card numbers, right? So we, as you all know, we frequently use, the e-commerce marketplace kind of platform, and then we do share our credit card. So it will be easier for us to actually click and buy, it's easier for us. When we talk about the data that we push into this platform, do we really know where the data is being stored? So that is the personal information that we need to actually being aware of. Because I think when talk about Google, talking about Microsoft, I think the nearest would be in Singapore. So probably our data now, there's some of our personal data is being stored, in Singapore. And if something happened to that data, right, the other people that is reaching out that data, do we have the, the power of any force to actually sue the company which is residing in Singapore? So that is the question that we need to ask ourselves as the consumer. So talking about the enterprises, I think Mr. Muzaki might have a better view because he get the data from the oil and gas, right? The geoseismic data coming from the collection from the the drilling that they've been done before, prior to the build up of the rig. So probably that data it has to be sovereign in nature. So it has to be in that particular country. It cannot be shared to other people. Then if let's say that data being leaked out to the world, probably the other people will actually devising a plan to actually get into that country and actually get to that information. So for us, I think the enterprises, the consumer, we as a consumer, we as an enterprise, we need to actually protect our data as much as possible, even though the PDPA itself is not being enforced. So we need to actually have that kind of awareness. So that will be my point.
Yep. All right. I think I'll just add a bit. I think both of you guys have covered quite comprehensive in terms of the impact, right? But when dealing with data, I think naturally as human, we don't think of the really the worst case scenario that can happen, right? So that's the kind of mindset that we need to instill, individually, personally as well, right? Where a lot of things can happen, as Mr. Charin mentioned. When someone know about a confidential data, a lot of things can happen where they can plan, what's next, what they can do with those kind of data. It depends on where or what are the data that's being really breached. So it can be personal data, it can be enterprise data, it can be a lot of data. So those kind of breaches technically create a lot of limitless opportunities for others. So people with bad things in mind, they can do a lot of things. So that's why I think in the first place we need to avoid what we can avoid. We need to mitigate, do a proper process. We need to beware of the possibilities of those leakages, because when that happened, then we can't really rewind and go back to the previous state, right? So ideally, yes, we would love to have that, but in reality, world, there's no such thing as rewinding and going back to the previous state, right? So that's why coming out with proper governance, proper structure is important. Mr. Benny did mention, about all different standards that we have globally. I think that's one way of, putting that standards in, that is there to really, cover certain angles, certain processes that can be put, in place properly, so that the possibility or the leakages, room for leakages would be very minimal and a controlled environment, right? So when you have it in control, when you have a some kind of incident, then you have what are the processes that would be taken, right, to cover those kind of incidents, in the essence of making sure it wouldn't be a bigger issue, and also in making sure that it won't repeat in the future as well, right? So lessons learned, that's important for every company, every individual, because to really have a look at what's happening in the market, not only in our organization, but in the market in general. There are a lot of things that happen. I think that's where I've had few engagement with several parties where we explore the kind of risks available globally, because all those risks would be our reference to make sure we don't have, or we don't face those kind of situation. I think that's important. And again, it's back to the type of data, but it's important for everyone to really plan and avoid, right, the best as we can, to make sure all those situation won't happen to us in general. Yeah. Over to you, Dr. Shima. Yeah.
Okay, so we see here there's a lot of the word, the synonymous use of the words data security with data sovereignty. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I had always assumed, okay, that when we talk about data sovereignty, we're really actually talking about the government's role in keeping our data safe, especially in commercial transactions. Now, can we clarify this? Because we've got a bit of confusion from the audience. Are we really talking about data sovereignty here, or are we talking just about security? So can somebody help us with that? Who's going to answer?
Maybe I would like to.
Yes, Mr. Benny.
Okay. When we talk about the data sovereignty, the security is one of the component of it. So one of the component as a mechanism on how to ensure and uphold the data sovereignty. But still the data sovereignty being still governed towards the rule, law and regulation within the nation that is the data being collected. So law and regulation is not towards the knowledge of expert within my boundary, but within the sub-component of the data sovereignty, which is on the security as a mechanism, that how we could relate so that the data sovereignty can be upheld. With the data security itself, it cannot fulfill the overall ecosystem of the data sovereignty. It still need to be put in within the what we call the law and regulation. That's the reason within the standard itself. As I mentioned, ISO 27001, the specific domain is about the compliance, identification of the related law, related regulations, and related legislation within that boundary need to be identified. instead of putting up the security technologies on the access control, on the cryptography, and others. So it need to be imposed on the policymaker. Need to set up the policy. The policy need to be built and endorsed by the country. Then it need to be mobilized, and then it need to be enforced.
Yes.
So that is the whole ecosystem. But then to answer on the security is one of the component as a mechanism to give the assurance.
It's the main part of data sovereignty is the security issue. Okay, so let's understand this entire data sovereignty better with an example. Can any one of our speakers give an example of perhaps a data sovereignty lawsuit that has happened in the history of using the internet? I know that British Airways, the data sovereignty lawsuit, or do you guys have any examples that you could share with the audience to help us understand how a breach of data sovereignty can cause, issues, consequences, undesired consequences to the company's customers, and so on and so forth? Our speakers would like to give an example of lawsuits for data sovereignty. Mr. Sharif?
I think Mr. Benny have some information on the GDPR lawsuit. It's not really a lawsuit. I think it's a breach of the the data confidentiality. So perhaps Mr. Benny can share his view on this GDPR breach. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Tia Sharinzam. I try not to speak too often within webinar, but yes, thank you for giving the opportunity. When we talk about the lawsuit, the perspective is about penalty, it's about fine. So let's not look about that. So when we talk about the governance on the rule and regulations, how to ensure that people follow, we need to give the penalty. There's a need to be a push factor for that. But that is the aftermath. So one of the sample that we have within the region in Asia, I want to relate back to the GDPR, the data breach that happened in Singapore, which is in the, I believe, somewhere middle of 2018. It happened around 2 weeks time, in the month of June, with the one organization known as a SingHealth. SingHealth is an organization that manage the data of the patient that living in Singapore. But that patient, as a customer of SingHealth is an organization that we can compare in Malaysia, like Pantai Medical, KPJ, yeah, Tawakal, and so on. So SingHealth do manage a massive data, millions of data related to their patients. But then some of the patient that render the service within SingHealth services is the EU citizen. So how does it relate the data sovereignty? How the EU bloc could uphold their data sovereignty across border, and when EU put up the law on the GDPR, it enforced not only within the EU bloc, it enforced to all their data, citizen data of EU that living outside the country. So, for example, on SingHealth, based on that data breach, based on the GDPR, any data breach related towards the EU citizen that happened outside of the border, then the organization need to report the incident 72 hours after the incident. But within the rule and regulation, there are some consequences if you delay. But those delay can also be justified. in terms of the investigation. So the penalty comes afterward if you do not comply. But then what EU bloc would like to do is you can rewind, as per mentioned by Mr. Mood, you can rewind on the events, but you can take a lesson learned. You can minimize the impact, you can minimize the incident, and you can minimize the aftermath on those incidents. So that's the reason the first thing that being put in place, the breach notification. Within that 72 hours need to be reported to the EU if that data breach related to the EU citizen living in Singapore. If it is a Malaysian, that's not a concern of the EU bloc. So that is what being put in within the GDPR for not only Asian, I think across the world, are bound because it's a bilateral. Everybody need to cooperate because EU is quite big. They can produce their own money, and then this law also being bound by other regions based on the main bloc and also main countries within the world. Maybe I would like to take this opportunity. How does it relate with Malaysia? Because TS Syariah and also Mr. Mood mentioned about the our PDPA is not. It can be relooked on the revision. I'm not expert in the law, but within the rule and regulation that being imposed within the bill of the Act 709 on the PDPA 2010, what is the difference between PDPA 2010, PDPA 2012, and also GDPR? So one of the area being looked is the breach notification. That is what still missing with PDPA 2010 Malaysia and also PDPA 2012 Singapore. But now Singapore already review their data sovereignty law to input this data breach notification. It just being endorsed by the Parliament of Singapore I believe last November last year in 2020, and they are expecting to enforce it not as early as February 2022. That is what with Singapore. But if I share something about Malaysia, this is something that I found within, because when we look up for this kind of information, Malaysia within the because we already benchmarking the data sovereignty law. So then we noticed that the breach notification and enforcement is one of the area that need an improvement. It is not lacking, need an improvement. So whereby in Malaysia, a public consultation paper on the number 01/2020, review on the PDPA Act 2010, on the PC 01/2020 dated on, I've not mistaken, February 14 on 2020. It seeks the view and comments from the public on, there are 22 issues being set out in this paper PC 01/2020 in order to tighten up. So Singapore already endorsed their revision of PDPA, which is inclusive on the breach notification and enforcement. So Malaysia also on the way to endorse, to review and also endorse on the new revision of the Act of the PDPA 2010. If we look what Singapore is doing right now in relation to this data breach notification, they do impose in specific like what EU bloc is imposing on the penalty. So what in the new revision, currently Singapore is enforcing a financial penalty, a maximum of not exceeding Singapore dollar of 1 million. That is within the current law PDPA 2012, and then they tighten up on the new revision, which is they put it the penalty of 10% of the organization turnover, annual turnover in Singapore for those that turnover exceed 10 million. So 10%. 10% of 10 million is 1 million, basically. But then if we benchmark it towards the GDPR, it's much more lower. For GDPR, they impose on 4% of the annual turnover. But then also Singapore also do put in an exclusion of Singapore dollar 1 million, whichever is higher. So if 10% is more than 1 million, then they will follow that amount of penalty. This is what being done by our nearest neighboring country in order for them to give the assurance towards the toward the region, so that the data sovereignty that being hosted by the cloud service provider in Singapore is being well protected, because they already ran it through on the data breach for 2018 previously. But still, I believe as a bloc of ASEAN, ASEAN could also play a role in this area, like what EU did, right? So the block economy and also the block of data sovereignty, maybe a standardized uniform of standard of law and regulation within the ASEAN in order to govern, rather than Malaysia is pushing it to the country of China, India, and also Europe, as well as we put ASEAN as a front. So it's much more stronger when we would like other people to adhere towards our data sovereignty at the end of the day. All right, Dr. Shima.
So are we good in the assumption that when we shop on Shopee and Lazada, which we do quite often these days, that the data that we share, our credit card information, our address, is safe, since these are platforms that are with Singapore? Let's say Shopee, I think, is with Singapore, and Lazada is an Alibaba company. So can we be assured that there's no data sovereignty breaches going on there because of the best practices that they have in place? Or should we still be careful when we are using these online shopping platforms? Mr. Benny? Just said that, Singapore has...
Yeah, the two speakers. All right. Yes. Looking into that, yes. What is the bottom line is that we know, because the data sovereignty is about the law and regulation or the data being processed within the nation. It is on a higher level context. But when we look into the Shopee, is on the individual context. So individual context, we look into the data security. So data security is one of the component of the data sovereignty. Then it fall on those individual to adhere on the level of competency, knowing, and also the awareness. But then still the nation still do protect the PII of that country citizen. For example, EU citizen that do the shopping in Singapore, the data being stored over there in Shopee, but Singapore still being bound by the GDPR if the data breach happen with Shopee. So in the nation context, Singapore is bound to the GDPR. But in our context, we need to ensure the sub-component of data sovereignty, which is security, we need to implement those best practices and it being supplemented by all other the laws and policies. Maybe the other speakers would like to add.
Ima, you unmute. I think I just want to echo back what Mr. Benny did mention, right? On our roles as a consumer, right? So definitely when you download, any marketplace or any apps from the provider, probably they will have the end user agreement. So you have to run through it, because whether we like it or not, the information that we shared in the application probably is being seen by other people. So we need to have a really understanding how is our data is being pushed. So I just want to take an example of Facebook, right? So when the Facebook is being launched in 2008 in ASEAN, in ASIA, in general, they don't have any proper rules to actually govern our personal data. So they can actually have our data and they can actually share it with other people. But somehow along the way, since 2008 until 2021, there's a lot of regulation act, being imposed to Facebook from US side. So they do have a lot of talking about the act, talking about the personal data. They did govern the data that they collect from us by Facebook. So from my point of view, right? So we as the consumer, we do have our own rights to actually understand where our data is being stored. So we need to start, put an act on ourselves. So how we want to govern ourselves so that we know the data that being shared, the personal data, the PII data that we shared through the apps is being governed. Probably SOCMED probably is not a good example because we know that when you are in the SOCMED, probably you actually share some of your personal data, but you need to know some of the application that probably not the SOCMED kind of application, the banking system. Probably now is e-wallet, financial institution kind of application. They have to be bound by the Sovereignty Act so that we can actually make sure our data is being protected. So I think that will actually sum up, the idea of why we need to put the awareness ahead of ourselves.
Okay, thank you, Mr. T.S. Sharir, for that. And Mr. Mood, do you want to add anything? Because it's already 12:26 and we have to end our session soon. Would you like to add anything?
Yep, I think on the same topic, I'll just chip in, some potentially key takeaways and comparison as well, right? So when we talk about data sovereignty, I think it's important and it is to a certain extent comforting as well, right? When we know, a certain applications like you mentioned, Shopee, Lazada, all those different applications being developed and also owned by different countries where they have, maybe to an extent advanced regulation and revised regulation as well, right? As Mr. Benny mentioned just now, in Singapore, for example, right? Having those regulation for sure does help in terms of making sure it's more secured, right? But I think, in essence, when we don't have, proper data sovereignty act or procedures in Malaysia, so technically the protection for us as Malaysian citizens would be a bit lower as compared to others and those countries in the Europe, Singapore or others that has revised their component for data sovereignty, right? So that's where I think the separation is that the platform would be more secured because they have those regulation, but that doesn't mean platforms in Malaysia is not secured, right? So for sure we would have different standards separately, even though it's not being governed by any law yet specifically, but the procedures or SOPs can be there to make sure it's really secured, right? And protect the users, right? But in terms of data sovereignty as a whole, the coverage is more of making sure whoever under their jurisdiction would be covered and protected. I think that's the main intention, right? So the European standards, the Singapore or other country standards, they would cover normally their citizens, even though it's being the breach would be in other places, right? But I think last one from me, as Mr. Benny mentioned just now, right? The breach notification is one of the core component for us, consumers. We don't really know when data breach would happen. We don't, if we are not notified, then we don't even know, right? But we would know when something bad happened from that incident, right? So that's where I think having those, additional clause, breach notification, that would give us visibility if something were to happen, for us to take necessary actions to protect ourselves individually or as a nation as well, right? So that's where those kind of revision is important. That there are effort being done by the government, but whether it's the direction and it's not completed yet, hopefully it will soon enough with all the conditions that we have in Malaysia over here, right? So all this revision needs to be done for us to make sure better security and also governance in our data, right? I think that's all from my end. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Mort, for that input. I think the key takeaway that we can learn from this really is that Malaysia still needs a little bit of revision with regards to the PDPA laws that we have in place for the betterment of the nation with regards to data sovereignty, keeping the citizens' data safe. And then we have to be responsible ourselves with regards to the data that we share in the social media platforms as well. Okay, that is our own responsibility because a lot of consequences can come out from that as well, and which I just seem to recall a current series that I watched on Netflix, a really interesting one, I think, with regards to data security. I think it was ClickBank. The guy
clickbait, right? Catfishing.
Yeah, the guy was murdered, and all sorts of things came out about him. And then, just to give you the ending, tapi somebody stole his identity and used it on a dating platform. So all these things came about him, and he was murdered not through his own fault. A really good Netflix series, I thought. So one of the consequences of sharing too much information of yourself on social media platforms, stolen identity. And for me as well, I just received a call not 2 days ago from a bank saying that someone had used my IC to apply for a loan. So we really, really have to be careful about this. And it's a good thing the bank called me to confirm this before they went ahead and processed it. So we really have to be careful about all the things that we share. And even if we share it, sometimes we go through the mall, people ask us to apply for a credit card, they ask for our IC numbers. How do we know that what we share with them is safe? Sometimes we eat at a restaurant and they want our IC numbers. How do we know that these places are taking our personal information and keeping it safe? I mean, it's just a restaurant who wants to give us a membership card, right? So with that in mind, government has to play its role. We as citizens have to play our role. Everything is being done online nowadays, and we're using into the internet more and more because of the pandemic and so on and so forth. So with that in mind, I would like to end our session. Thank you to all the attendees. I hope that we have increased our knowledge somewhat through this session. Thank you to all the panel speakers. Thank you for ACASIA for hosting us. And with that, I would like to say Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And goodbye.